Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming to this talk on such a glorious day. I know it's very tempting to be outside, but I think that development is the most important subject in the world, and so I'm glad you have prioritized it, at least for your lunchtime. It's important because it's not only about what happens with other people. I think in the end it's about ourselves and who we are as people. And what I try and convey in this very short introduction is everything I know about development in 40,000 words, which is about 30-something years of my life and career working in development. I've been fortunate to work in many, many different roles in this. I've worked for development agencies. I've worked for the World Bank. I've worked for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I was head of policy for the World Bank Group. And I've also been on the other side of the table. I've negotiated on behalf of countries with the international agencies, and I was in the South African government as Nelson Mandela's economic advisor, and ran the State Development Bank for Southern Africa, owned by the South African government. And so it was really a delight to be asked by OUP to write this short book, but a big challenge. A big challenge because as much as we've learned over the last 70 plus years about why some people are rich and why some people are poor and why some countries are rich and some countries poor, why development takes off and then reverses, and how to achieve it, what's extraordinary is how much we don't know. And how difficult development remains, how intractable it remains in some places, despite the quite extraordinary advances. And so one has to approach this subject, I think, with a degree of humbleness, because each case is different. There's no cookie cutter, and there's certainly no recipe for development. If it was so simple, the whole world would have escaped poverty, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. At the same time, we can celebrate huge success with development. There have been the most extraordinary achievements in my lifetime, and many of you are younger than me, in your lifetimes. And so there must be some things we can learn from all of this. There must be some takeaways, and what the book tries to do is strike this balance between not wanting to imply that there's a recipe, but also not wanting to imply that we haven't learned. For those that are curious, this is a wonderful subject because there's so much evidence out there, the world's 200 plus countries in the experience over the last hundreds of years, but there's also massive uncertainties and questions going forward, which remain unresolved. And so I would encourage anyone that's interested in development to remain interested and not think that anyway, tick that box, there's nothing to add, because everyone has much to add. And I think it's particularly interesting being in Google, because one of the great, great questions is how will technological change impact on development going forward? And I'll say something about that, but we know very little about it. And I certainly don't subscribe to some people in Silicon Valley's view, not the sensible people in Google, of course, which is, I guess, best articulated in a book, which I better not name, which suggested that there's no problem an app cannot solve. In other words, technology will be the panacea that cures the world's problems, whether it's climate or water or poverty, etc. At the same time, there's massive advances that technology can certainly offer, and we need to think about this very, very carefully. So for me, the great revelation was, of course, having been an exile from South Africa, thinking I would never go back in my lifetime, living in London and Paris, to discover how quickly change can happen. 2 months after the Berlin Wall came down, Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years in prison, and I never thought I would have that event in my lifetime. I thought South Africa was in an intractable, bloody civil war for the future. And that dramatic change changed my life too, because I then went back and worked with him for the next 7 years. Now, these tipping points, these rapid changes, are clearly both about the forces that are happening in individual countries, but also elsewhere. And so one of the great challenges is understanding the interconnectedness between changes in one place and changes in another, and that is getting more complex. Within 5 years of the Berlin Wall, dictatorships across the world fell. Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which had been largely autocratic, became largely democratic over a very short period of time. Not because of things that they were doing necessarily, although that no doubt contributed, but from things that were happening in Europe. Big change. And this story of the interaction between policies in one country or one set of countries and what happens is, of course, a very old story in development. Colonialism, imperialism being part of that problem. So you can fight as hard as you want for change in your country, and I believe people should be fighting for that. But what others do and how the world behaves matters desperately as well. And that's why we are all responsible for development, because what the UK does or what the US does or what Google does really does matter to the prospects for people's lives in other places, consciously and unconsciously. Now, one of the most other dramatic effects of this tumbling down of walls and of the growth of the internet and interconnectedness has been this extraordinary story of the improvement of life expectancy around the world. And that's because ideas are traveling more rapidly, more quickly to more places than ever in history. And ideas are the driving force of history. It's what makes the difference between how one used to do things and how one can do things. And that imagination about what the future is what drives development ambitions. If you do a thought experiment and try and think about why is North Korea now 10% of the income of South Korea when they were at the same income levels 60 years ago, the answer has to be because their ideas are different and the way that those are being operationalized in their country. Same people, no cultural differences or other differences between these people. And the same story could be told, for example, of East and West Germany and their very, very different living standards, etc. But we should be careful not to fall into the trap that says, oh, well, one is simply market forces and the other is not. Cuba has a higher average life expectancy than the US, although it's only got 20% of its average per capita income levels. So it's not simply about markets, it's about how much countries prioritize things, what their policies are, that really does make a difference. But if you're feeling that policy doesn't matter, just do these sorts of thought experiments, and I talk about some of them in the book. Ghana and South Korea used to have the same incomes in 1965. In fact, Ghana was wealthier than South Korea. Today, South Korea has an income which is 14 times that of Ghana. Argentina used to be the 5th richest country in the world. Today it is the 65th. What's happened? Why is this the case? Those are the sorts of things I explore in the book. And bad policies have a lot to do with it. By policies, I mean the decisions that governments make regarding the key drivers of development. And they are health, education, infrastructure, the hardware, and the software. And it's that, judicial systems, rule of law, that really make an enormous difference. Now, because ideas are traveling more rapidly around the world, there's some things which are sometimes slightly independent of national policy. And life expectancy is broadly although there's some major exceptions like that. So average life expectancy has increased in the world by about 20 years over the past 40 years. It took from the Stone Age to the 1960s to get that sort of improvement in life expectancy. And it's because ideas have traveled more rapidly, particularly since about 1990 and then the late 90s with the development of the internet. Very simple ideas, like washing your hands prevents contagious diseases, smoking kills you, wearing a safety belt saves your life. Those sorts of ideas. And very, very complex ideas, like those embedded in vaccines, in new cures for cancer, spreading around the world. Some big exceptions, notably Southern Africa, because of HIV/AIDS, where life expectancy went down by 20 years, when in the rest of the world it went up, simply because of HIV/AIDS, and Russia for a whole set of other circumstances where life expectancy has decreased by about 10 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, as the health system has collapsed, as suicide, smoking, car accidents, and other things, crime, take their toll. Now, one of the most difficult questions is what do we mean by development? And of course, when I talk about development, I'm talking about the development of individuals' lives and capabilities, as well as economic development. Other people, my wife, who's a psychotherapist, has a completely different meaning for the term. And of course, the fundraising office at Oxford is called the Development Office. So when you Google development, you get many different things. And that was a big question in naming this book, because we might get the wrong people picking it up. And I thought, well, that was a good thing anyway. So let's have a term that has lots of different meanings, where lots of people might pick it up by mistake and learn something. But this concept remains very contested. Economists tend to think of this as economic development. So they'd say a country is more developed if it has a higher per capita income. Of course, that is an extremely imperfect understanding of what development is. There are countries like Bangladesh, for example, have average life expectancy of 75. I mentioned Cuba and its life expectancy. And there are some much wealthier countries that have had lower life expectancies. There are countries like Bangladesh, again, that have very low fertility rates. And other countries at much higher incomes that have much more rapid fertility. There are countries that have higher levels of girls' education, etc. So defining what we mean by development is pretty crucial in order to have a conversation about what are we striving for as a society. Are we striving for higher incomes? Do we need growth in order to get development? Or can you have development without growth? Which I don't think is possible, not at low levels of income, which is why this let's get away from growth idea that the rich countries are sometimes falling in love with, particularly the Greens, I think doesn't work for, say, Africa, because if you're at a per capita income level of $2,000, you better grow if you want to raise that. No amount of redistribution. But does the US still need to grow? Does Britain still need to grow? That's an interesting question. What is it that we mean by development in these contexts? And of course, this is changing all the time. Now, one of the most exciting things is the capabilities approach, which says that development is about people's ability to transform their own lives. And this is Amartya Sen, who really was at the forefront of this. That's how we should think about development. Do people have agency? Are people able to affect their own futures? And that's both about, well, you better be alive in order to it. You better be properly nourished. You better be educated to know about what the options are. You better be healthy. And you better have freedoms and rights in order to affect your own outcome. And I'm very attracted to this capabilities approach. As people become more and more educated around the world, they learn more. But we should be careful not to fall into the trap to believe that simply more education means more freedom, because we know that this isn't true. And one of the great challenges for development is understanding why highly educated people sometimes make decisions which seem to be contrary to development. And I'm thinking, for example, about the highly educated jihadists, for example, who on average have very high levels of education. So education in itself is, I don't believe is a development objective. It's a means. And that's true of many, many different dimensions. Because there are more people in the world, educated and connected, we should expect more rapid change. And a crucial question of development is, can societies adapt fast enough? Let's say you develop today, will you be developed tomorrow? And as the world changes more rapidly, this becomes a bigger and bigger concern. And it's a concern not only between countries, it's a concern within countries. Is the reason we have Trump and Brexit because some parts of Britain or some parts of the US are developing much more rapidly than other parts, for example? And this increasing differentiation within countries is a big concern. Now, I talked about how the world changed since the Berlin Wall came down. And some describe this as a process of globalization, which I talk a bit about in the book, by which we simply mean flows across national borders of goods, services, products, and ideas. Got a bad rap recently, but my view is this is the most progressive force for development that history has ever known. But it's also the most dangerous and potentially the ugliest. You see these transformations in flows depicted here. As the walls came down, the flows between countries of financial flows, in this case, investment, aid, the black is private equity and bonds, and foreign direct investment increased. But so too did their complexity. And one of the great challenges going forward for countries is managing complexity, is that everything comes from more and more places. And where you fit into supply chains and where you fit into the realm of ideas and how you influence things is becoming more complex. Now, development really does happen. These are two simple graphs of the last 2,000 years, or two simple lines, depicting income growth, that's red exponential, and population growth, that's green arithmetic. The simple point of this is that we're in a period which is unprecedented in progress in our lifetimes, both in terms of income growth and population growth. The great challenge thinking forward is this sustainable? Will these very unusual patterns be replicated going forward? And I believe the pace of this change is because of integration of ideas. Because evolution, in effect, is happening more quickly because people are discarding their old ideas and taking on new ideas quicker about how to do things and how to learn, how to get girls into school, how to stay healthy, how to do things of that sort of nature. So we see in this period average life expectancy increasing. We see illiteracy going down dramatically. In a world of 5 billion people at the end of the 80s, only 2 billion people could read and write. In a world of 7.5 billion people today, 6.5 billion people can read and write. 4.5 billion more literate people. And if you believe in that knowledge as a way of getting agency of your own life, learning, that of course is the most exciting thing. It's also the reason I believe this is the slowest lunch hour you'll know for the rest of your lives. Relax and enjoy it. And that's because there are more people with more ideas participating more and more in the challenging and replication and invention of new ideas and their application to their local environments. So innovation is accelerating because there are more participants and they're sparking off each other in new ways. Both random distribution of genius, just more geniuses, but also sparks, more sparks flying. And as a result of all of this, the number of desperately poor people has gone down by about 300 million, despite the world's population going up by over a billion. And this has never happened before in history. We have rapid population growth and a reduction in poverty at the same time. So something is happening in our lifetimes which is extraordinarily exciting and leads to a great optimism that poverty can actually be overcome. We should be able to live to see a world of no poverty, but will we? And that is the question that's on the development agenda. And of course, it's not only about poverty that we care about many other things as well. Now, the SDGs and other agendas out of the UN are the first collective effort, Sustainable Development Goals, Millennium Development Goals preceding it, to establish collective goalposts. And that's very important, because when one has collective goalposts, team players know what to do. And the teams, of course, are the countries themselves, plus everyone around the world trying to help them in the public and private sectors, as well as in charitable and other institutions. Has this led to great progress? Yes. But of course, the ambitions are high, and much, much more needs to be done. In addition to writing this very short introduction, I've written over the last couple of years this book, Age of Discovery, which is arguing that this is a Renaissance moment in human history. The best time by far to be alive, but also, like the Renaissance, not only associated with enormous creativity that we'll celebrate, obviously in that case 500 years later, but also a perilous time. You know, the Renaissance ended in religious wars and complete destruction of the intellectual environment and experts, as well as the hounding of all diversity out of Europe, including the Inquisitions, etc. And the question is how one manages rapid development and social and political change. And I address that both in the Age of Discovery and in the very short introduction. Now, development is a very uneven process. And one of the great challenges is that while the differences between countries have been reduced, with an exception of about the bottom 25 countries who are in conflict or in fragile states, and we can come back to those if you'd like to in conversation, increasingly we see differences within countries. And this poses very big questions for development agencies and others, because if a country is on average can afford to overcome poverty, why should external parties have a role to play in it? What is the role of outsiders in overcoming poverty, for example, in the northeast of Brazil and other middle-income countries? Of course, many countries remain in dire poverty, not least in Africa. Now, rising inequality is largely the result of the very uneven distribution of the benefits of globalization. In other words, some places, particularly dynamic cities, are doing much better than rural areas and smaller decaying towns, whether it's in India or whether it's in the US or whether it's in the UK. And another very big issue, these are just numbers around inequality. Another big issue associated with this is, of course, taxation and the ability of governments in a globalized world to get the revenues to pay for redistribution, to invest in health, education, infrastructure, all the things that governments have to invest in. And the poorer the country is, the greater the need for investment. So a crucial area is what is the relationship between globalized firms and globalized tax systems and national financial capabilities for development. And that's one aspect of the international responsibility towards development. So one big issue going forward, which is a newer issue, is this rising inequality within countries and how one addresses it. A second big issue is growing systemic risk. When we connect and when we open our borders and have interconnected systems, whether they're cyber systems, airport hubs, or financial systems, we don't only grow our capabilities, but we grow our interdependency. And the challenge for many countries, particularly poor countries, is managing this interdependency. How do we ensure that they have the capability to not be either the spreaders or the importers of financial crises, pandemics, cyber attacks, etc. This interdependency is growing as we become more numerous, wealthier, and more interconnected. When people were poor in the countryside, they could do whatever they wanted that didn't affect the world. But as they become wealthier and more connected, all their actions and all our actions have spillover effects. So one is this contagion between systems and interdependency, the underbelly of interconnectivity. A second dimension of this, of course, is the spillover effects of the goods becoming the bads. It's wonderful that so many countries are escaping energy poverty and climbing the energy curve. That's fantastic. At the same time, a possible result is catastrophic climate change. It's wonderful that so many people around the world are taking antibiotics. A possible outcome is rapidly rising antibiotic resistance. It's wonderful that people in other countries have the options to enjoy tuna sushi like you do in your canteen. Possible outcome is extinction of the tuna. The summing up of the goods, when more and more people enjoy development, can lead to very bad outcomes. And the challenge here is to understand that we all have a responsibility in this. That as people become more connected, their freedom grows, they have more choice as their income grows and as their ability to choose and take drugs, or, I mean, not recreational drugs, antibiotics and other drugs, maybe recreational drugs, but we won't comment on that. Have the lights on, etc. But with that freedom comes a new responsibility. And that is a recognition that our freedoms have to be curtailed if we want others to be able to enjoy them too. And this is a big, big challenge to the market system. Now, I'm going to rush through, because I've taken a bit more time than I planned on this, some mega trends. I mentioned rising life expectancy, converging, except for Southern Africa, collapsing because of HIV/AIDS. I mentioned fertility going down, except for Africa, where the uncertainty is primarily in 4 countries, Nigeria, Niger, and a couple of others. So world life expectancy improving, but because of fertility going down, populations flattening and declining in many countries. I do not believe, and I put out the arguments in the book, that that the problem is too many people in the world, which of course some people worry about in case of development. The world's population be flattening, median ages doubling around the world, Africa the only exception, and that changes many things, including schooling. So we need to remove from our mental map ideas of population pyramids and put in place these sorts of structures, which are the structure of the future. And they have a dramatic implication for many things, and they also demonstrate what all the women in the room know, which is women are wiser than men. Women live longer in all countries of the world. They have better development prospects. And the simple answer is they don't make as many stupid decisions. They don't smoke as much, they don't drink as much, they don't stick as many knives into each other, they don't drive as many cars into as many trees, and they live longer around the world. But the opposite in every country of the world, more young boys than girls. And the reason is because we all live in sexist societies, and the status, income, career prospects of boys are greater than girls, and the girls no longer look after us in our old age. And so people are choosing, when they only have one kid, to have more boys than girls. And this is a global phenomenon. So increasingly skewed distribution, and that of course has dramatic consequences for many things. Every country is unique. China, one-child policy. US immigration, very significant. I did this before Trump was elected, and it matters because over half the children born in the US to immigrant parents. So if you change immigration policy, you remove this healthy outlook for the US. Different African countries, different perspectives. Nigeria, massive population growth, as with Kenya, impact of HIV having this dramatic shadow in many countries, and of course particularly South Africa, terribly distorted by HIV/AIDS. This is Botswana with and without HIV/AIDS. The light what it would be without, and the dark with. So these things can just wreck development prospects for country. Botswana, in other respects, a well-managed economy with lots of resource, diamonds, but wrecked by failure to manage this. Migration becomes a bigger and bigger part of the development story. Now, migration has always been the way that countries have dealt with development. The reason we all here is because of development, if not first, second, or third generation. It's always been the way that people escaped poverty, famine, disease, and war. A third of Ireland migrated, a third of Scandinavia migrated, a third of Italy migrated. But as that option becomes closed off to people, and the number of countries increased, there's 100 more countries in the world over the last 100 years. The potential for migration is doing what it's always served humanity to do, which is give people opportunity to get away from trouble and find new potential. That option is being closed off. And so development has removed from a central place this absolutely key potential, which is migration. Now, migration is good not only for people that migrate, but also for the societies they're leaving because of remittances going back, and the societies they're going to because of what they contribute to those societies. None of our societies in the rich countries would be anything like what they are. Indeed, I argue that all great civilizations have depended on massive inflows of immigrants. So migrants are exceptional people, and migration shaped our world and will define our future in the way that it manifests, and this is a previous book. And what the very short introduction does, which is partly why I was able to do it, is it draws on all my books on globalization, migration, financial flows, and other things. The workforces of the world change dramatically, and Africa becomes by far the most significant source of labor. And a key question for Africa is, can it fulfill this potential? That's both about education, which is, there's a very positive story to be told, illiteracy declining, but it's also about the fact that it's 54 different fragmented countries, and so its political future is important. When one looks at the economic prospects of countries, the startling thing is how important development has become. Developing countries, what we used to call developing countries, and that term itself is subject to revision. And I have a little graph or table in the book which shows how these terms keep changing, as they rightly should. But these, what some call emerging markets, now account for 2/3 of global growth. Without them, we would be in a much worse state in the UK or the US. They are lifting global growth. They are the engine of global growth. They're also the stabilizers of global growth because there are many more growth engines. In other words, when the US gets a cold, the rest of the world no longer gets fever because of China, because of India, because of other countries. So we should thank them for their development success. And our development now depends more and more on their development, which is a great irony of history. Many countries that we think of as developing countries will overtake us in per capita terms. Many countries become richer than the UK. And of course, when you compound these growth rates, you have to divide the total income growth by the population, which is why China goes above $30,000 per capita and India doesn't go above 10 and Africa above 5. But this is very sensitive to what assumptions one makes, not only on economic growth, but on population growth. How these population dynamics transfer into income levels matters desperately, and are the key uncertainties of some very big countries in Africa, where you see this difference in per capita and in average income levels. Now, this also, of course, doesn't talk about the inequalities that are behind it. And that goes back to this question of we move towards a world in where the only countries that are on average desperately poor are the countries that are failed states in some respects or in conflict. And then within the middle income countries, how does one tackle these distributional questions? The middle class, defined as $10 per day, explodes around the world in its size. 4.9 billion middle class consumers by 2030. These are the people buying your products and going online. And in this, the center of gravity is firmly towards Asia. Now, a key question is this adding up question. This is another book I've done. Is there enough for everyone in the world to develop? What about the resource constraints? Is the planet full, our planet? And here I'll come back to a few observations, but I think we have to say it depends. It depends partly on what happens with technology, but it also depends on behavior in the rich countries as well as in the developing countries. New York State consumes more antibiotics than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. New York State consumes more energy than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not about numbers, it's about consumption patterns and behavior that really determines one's outlook as how we're going to manage resources going forward. Now, you know more than most about revolutionary technologies, and I hope one thing you've learned is that you cannot predict the future unless you're even smarter than all the great minds that have ever tried before. But we know that there are some predictables, like Moore's Law. And the Oxford Martin School, which I was the director of for 10 years, we have over 50 people working on aspects of this. We think it's going to continue for about the next 20 years. So we'll have 100,000 to a million times the power. And so revolutionary technologies like nanomedicine, this is from my nano lab, or stem cell, this is from our stem cell lab that we created, this is a heart cell, or genetic manipulation, become a real possibility. And a key question, I think, for all of us is how will these technologies play through the world, and will they widen inequalities or narrow inequalities? Will these extraordinary technologies like gene therapy, the back mouse, a wild mouse, the front mouse, a modified mouse going for 10 times the time, will these technologies increase them? Will only the rich have them? Will they only be available in rich countries? These are key questions. Because these technologies are advancing at super exponential speed. And so one of the key questions for developing countries is, do they understand what's going on? And have they got the capabilities of using them to address development questions? Now, I'm very concerned about this because I think in the UK, for example, we don't really understand. The government isn't really on top of technological change. So how, or in the US for that matter, so how do we expect a poor African country to be on top of it? Risk is a whole nother question. Risk is very asymmetric. Remember that risk disproportionately impacts on poor people and poor countries. Rich people can buy themselves out of trouble largely. We see the rapid growth in the US in cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas, which is quite an interesting story, seeing they're both in the middle of the desert. Just pipe deeper from longer, turn the aircon on, and survive in the desert, no problem. In fact, not survive, thrive. These are rapidly growing cities. The same options are obviously not open to people living in the Sahel. So this disproportionate impact leads to a greater need for anyone that cares about development to manage risk. Climate change, pandemics, everything, financial crises, impact on the poor and poor countries much more than their impact on the rich. And that's one of the great challenges going forward, is how to manage risk and to ensure that we mitigate the risks that come out of interconnectivity. These are not new, but their pace and scale is different. The swine flu that starts in Mexico City is in 130 countries in 30 days. That's new. And so the preparedness of countries to this, we've modeled and shown it replicates airline traffic, and preparing countries for the cyber vulnerabilities. Can hackers close down a country? Or malicious governments or other forces destroy their systems, their financial systems and others? And how do we help them become resilient to that? Because these are very, very big challenges. As the cyber becomes the new nervous system of the world, and as we move into the Internet of Things, this becomes more important. Another great challenge of the future is, how do we think about technology and jobs going forward? Now, you might be familiar with the work that I developed with colleagues in Oxford, which suggests that about 47% of US jobs are vulnerable to machine intelligence and AI over the next 20 to 30 years, about 40% of European jobs. And the proportions are much higher for developing countries. Why is this? Because we believe that anything that's repetitive and rules-based that doesn't require dexterity or empathy is likely to be disintermediated by AI over the coming decades. So if you take away the middle rungs of the development ladder, those middle rungs which are repetitive tasks, be they in manufacturing or be they in call centers or back offices, and replace them with AI, what is the development model for countries? What are we going to be replacing this with? And how can these people escape poverty in that world of AI? Will they have the skills? Can we just say they will become creative and do things that machines cannot do? And if we at the same time closing the migration gates to them, do we have a new challenge? And of course, this is coinciding with many other things like 3D printing. This is footage I filmed at SpaceX, titanium printing. So reshoring of production, of course, the politics of nationalism and xenophobia feeding into this is very, very scary. So as we think about this relationship, this interconnectivity is very, very important. So too are these issues of the commons. Nature has no price. We know that no matter how much the rhino horn is worth, they won't reproduce more. And that's true of all natural systems. And they become increasingly important for developing countries who depend on these natural resources. Of course, governments sharing these resources aren't good. This is the Aral Sea. And so climate change really matters. And it particularly matters to poor people in poor places. And that's why stopping climate change or slowing its rate of increase is dramatically important. You know, we might enjoy the fact that we've had the hottest May bank holiday on record in the UK. But this is extremely worrying for developing countries particularly. We have to come up with a model that allows people to climb the development curve and have energy forms which are different. And we have to appreciate the vulnerabilities, particularly in agriculture, but not only. The most rapidly growing cities in developing countries are seafront cities. That's where 80% of the growth of dynamism is, on these coastal cities. So climate change dramatically affects crops. Now, the global governance system is totally unfit for 21st century purpose, rearranging the furniture, and countries are like individual cabins on an ocean liner with no captain on the deck. Like so many aspects of development, this is an unintended negative of a very good thing. We can celebrate the fact that the world is no longer run by 12 white men smoking cigars in a room. In the latest climate change negotiations, there were 35,000 participants, and the process was run by a woman, Laurence Toubiana. So that's wonderful. At the same time, in this time of handover, there's lack of leadership. So what international information systems do is important. The best institutions in the best places, the best expert systems, notably those in finance, in our central banks, treasuries, IMF and others, have proved themselves totally incapable. And so when we see this rejection of experts and authority, we need to understand it's real. Us experts, I'm talking about myself, have let the system down by allowing a financial crisis to happen, which has particularly affected poor people and vulnerable people. Life expectancy and other attributes of development are not improving in many parts of the advanced economies, let alone in the poor countries. So these distribution questions are more and more important. However, the idea that you can withdraw from this is profoundly misguided. There's no wall high enough that will keep out climate change, a pandemic, a cyber attack, or any of the real threats to our futures. But what these high walls do keep out is the technologies, the ideas, the people, the products, the services that we need to navigate and thrive in the future. And of course, what these high walls mostly keep out is our ability to cooperate, which is absolutely central. So I prefer the concept of entanglement. to globalization. We're in an entangled world. We're in a world in which everything that we do matters for others, and what they do matters for us. And that's why development, in the end, is about being more connected, but not being more vulnerable. In feeling an empathy with people around the world. And of course, your technologies allow us to do that. To share an experience with people around the world in a way which was just unimaginable in the past. But whether that leads to a new learning of our interconnectedness and helps us to understand that actually we are the development agencies. Development is not about someone else, somewhere else. Development's about us. It's what we do every minute of our lives, the choices we make, the things that we consume, the way we develop products and services, and a consciousness that it's these kids in the end that will be as entwined with our future as our neighbors next door. So this is an ambitious little book. It tries to do the past, present, and future of globalization in 40,000 words. I hope you find it really, if there's any word in it you don't understand, send me an email or connect me on Twitter, because it's designed for non-specialists. But if you find it is dumbed down, then also send me a message and say, I haven't challenged you enough, because it wants to strike that balance between inviting people into the conversation, but also giving them a sense of the challenges. And that's what, if it does, I'll be happy to have achieved. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions. So I'm going to put your hands up and I'll come to you with the mic. And I'll kick us off if you want to think of something to ask. So I was just thinking, you alluded to education and the importance of education. And I was just thinking about how you've got world leaders who reject experts, you've got world leaders who don't seem to have a good grasp on human history. What impact does that have? And more importantly, what should leaders know? What understanding should they have of what's gone before them? And then how does that trickle down when you're looking at educating the future generations?
Yeah. The only leader that I've been bowled over by in my life, and I've met many leaders, was Nelson Mandela. And it was because what he had above all was an ability to listen and to learn and to be curious. No leader, no matter how powerful or intelligent or whatever, could possibly be on top of everything that's going on in the world, and possibly understand what they need to know. And it's that ability to ask the right questions and listen, but also change your mind. Nelson Mandela had basically become, by the time he had come out of prison, a pretty heavy socialist. The prevailing position of his party was nationalization of the mines, of the banks, and a whole lot of policies which not only did he not see through, but he abandoned pretty quickly on coming out, because he was able to interrogate the facts and learn and change his mind and not at all be ashamed, or that changing your mind is somehow a sign of weakness, which our leaders seem to think. They basically want to be know-alls in a world where know-all is impossible. The other thing is, of course, to be slightly more humble. There's no leader, no country, be it the US or China, that can shape their future anymore. And that's because we're in an entangled world. What happens in other places is as likely to shape the futures of their citizens as... And that attribution problem, the ability to stand up and say, vote for me, not that I will guarantee you a job or I will guarantee you a future, because that's definitely a lie. But vote for me because I will do my best to work with others to do that, is a more honest thing. We seem to not have that capability, this huge nationalism. And I think what's so interesting to me about Macron is not only that he used new technology in the same way that the extreme right wing and extreme left wing did to disintermediate authority in traditional political parties, but he did it on a pro-globalization, pro-Europe ticket, which is, in France, not the most popular winning strategy. I don't think his opinion pollsters would have told him, be pro-globalization, that's where to become a French president. But he did it, because of the strength of his conviction, he took 70% of the French population with him. So that ability to lead because you are able to make a convincing argument around the case is something our leaders don't seem to be able to have in a positive way, in an optimistic way.
Hi, Ian. Thanks so much. Really, really interesting. I'll definitely get hold of the book. I have two young children.
You've been given it by Google, thankfully.
I have two young children, and sometimes, the sort of the future worries me. It looks a bit pessimistic, a bit gloomy. That type of. What would be your advice for me as a parent in terms of how they may take or how I may help them take ownership of their own futures and their own careers and things?
Well, I discussed this a little bit in this book, but I also discussed it explicitly in Age of Discovery in the concluding chapter, this sort of advice for different groups. My own sense is what we all need, but particularly young people. Remember, their life expectancy is probably over 100 in a world that's changing more rapidly, so we cannot possibly predict what they're going to be encountering in the future, what skills they'll need or anything like that. I think what you need to be able to do is have a curiosity, have an interest in learning and relearning, taking on new ideas, an openness to people and diversity in all its forms, and a flexibility to change your mind and to feel welcoming of new ideas and people, and a resilience as well, because there are going to be tough times ahead. There's a lot of systemic risk in the system, and that psychological ability to bounce back and have an inner core which sustains you, I think will be important for people. And that's based on things like values, on a common humanity, on ethical principles, on family, on principles like that which are very difficult to teach. As a professor at Oxford, I often get asked the question by aspiring parents, not so much the kids, but the parents, should my kid do maths or should they do humanities for the future or whatever? What subject is future-proof? And my view on that is that there's no subject that's future-proof. Computers are pretty good at maths. But you need maths to program them. So, for the time being, maths is a good subject, or computer science. But I'm not sure it will be in a machine learning world in 20 years' time. But what we really need as well is ethic and humanities, understanding of history, etc. And that's what Age of Discovery tries to convey. If you had asked Da Vinci that question, he would have looked at you in total amazement. And he wouldn't understand what the concept was. What discipline was he? Or Adam Smith, for that matter. Or any of these people. This idea of disciplinary silos is a new idea. And it's increasingly fragmented and is a dangerous idea. Now, you have to be expert in one subject, and specialization is growing. So you have to focus more on one subject. I don't believe that we can just be master of everything. At the same time, it requires an understanding that silo that you're in, you need a T-shape. You need to be able to spread and understand different ideas if you want to survive in the future. And so both are necessary. And you might need to create a different vertical over time as the needed verticals change, but the horizontal will not change. That'll be your stabilizer.
I was just wondering if you've looked at where the dollar stops and kind of general well-being kicks in, or is that a luxury that's just afforded to the UK, the US?
No, it's until about $20,000 per capita, or maybe less, depending on the size, $15,000 per capita. You're in a world where you need more money in order to be able to basically have enough food to pay for health and education. But over that, the improvements are not great. There's a big issue about debt, which is why the rich countries have to keep growing, because they've got so much debt they have to repay it. There are big issues on distribution. If 1% of the population is capturing 80% of the wealth, the number of people in the world that could fit on a double-decker bus have half the wealth of the world. I have over 3 billion people's wealth. That matters in terms of whether you think how much money do you need. So these average per capita numbers don't mean very much to someone who's poor in the middle of the UK or the US. and desperately in debt and about to be evicted from their house because they can't pay the rent and they don't have a job. Tell them that they don't need more jobs in the country. So distribution really matters. But I do believe that we should see as a medium-term goal basically well-being, sustainability, and other things. We don't need to be on average wealthier in the UK, for example, or in the US. The problem is distribution. And it's also, of course, the consumption bundle. The US is already, and the UK, consuming too much too much carbon fuel, much too much other non-sustainable products. So we have to change our mix in the process as well. Well-being is an important concept. I mean, economists are very crude. They always fall back on income. And that's because there's no other broadly comparable measure. And well-being concepts are particularly slippery. So you can ask people, how do you feel? That's, you know, a typical well-being happiness index. Very weird results you get. You can look at other measures like suicide, depression, alcoholism, so as indicators of how happy societies are or not, or groups within society. But then you also do get cultural differences like that shape that. So I think we need to move to much broader sustainability, well-being types of dashboards for our society where we talk about all the things that we want to achieve and achieve them.
Thank you very much. That's out of time. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for the opportunity.